thank you both for having this conversation. I'm excited about it, and I really think that this is helpful for Christians to just sit down and have conversations. So not only do I think that it will be helpful for us, but I think that modeling these kinds of conversations for other people is incredibly important. So I'm going to allow both of y'all to introduce yourself. Charles, we'll start with you, if you don't mind, just kind of telling us a little bit about you, and so that everybody that's watching will get to know you a little bit, brother.
Well, thank you, Wes. And I appreciate you all for having this opportunity for forum for us to have a conversation, because that really is what this is about, for people to have conversations. Just a little bit about me. I became a Christian in 1989, served in a number of congregations around the state, in Midland and in Abilene, served as deacons of congregations in Arlington, served as a deacon of a congregation, and here in Dripping Springs, where I now attend, served as a deacon as well as an elder for a period of time before work and those type of things kind of got in the way of what I felt my duties and responsibilities were to oversee the flock. I worked in state government for more than 30 years, served at the office more than 26 of those years in the child support division. Started out as a volunteer and rose up to be the head of the division. Was appointed to that position by then Attorney General Greg Abbott, who's now the governor of the state of Texas. Once he became governor, I was reappointed to my position by current Attorney General Ken Paxton. Ultimately, the governor appointed me as the Chief Deputy Executive Commissioner for the Health and Human Services Commission in 2015, and then in 2016 as the Executive Commissioner for the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, which at that time was the largest state agency in the country, with a $40 billion a year budget and roughly about 50,000 employees. It's gone through some restructuring since then, and it's a little smaller now, but the budget is still pretty much the same. And then retired from state government in 2018 and currently own a consulting practice now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, brother. And I've got to say that as we were setting all of this up, we not only discovered that we attended some of the same congregations over the years, but your father-in-law actually preached my wedding and was my wife's preacher growing up, and was actually my mom's preacher growing up as well. So Gary Montgomery, your father-in-law, has played a big role in my life and in my family's life. So there's all sorts of connections. So I'm really glad to know you, and really glad to be part of this conversation with you, brother.
Thank you. It really says a lot, because if we actually sit down and begin to have conversations with people, we would probably find out that we have a lot more in common with people than we do that isn't in common. And so it's about having that conversation. And so I was glad that we had the opportunity to do this. And so I think it's going to be great.
Absolutely. And Jacob?
Well, my pedigree isn't nearly as interesting as Charles. I am just the minister here at the Dripping Springs Church. I consider myself a friend of Charles. I have a lot of respect for him. I've been working with the congregation here for about 5 years now, but I knew Charles and his family before that. Have always had an immense amount of respect for him and his wisdom, his experience. And so I'm just thankful to be a part of this conversation with both of you, guys that I love and that I respect, and trying to come from this from the position of seeking to understand, and to Charles and I had really, this came out of a conversation that Charles and I had last week, where we talked for well over 2 hours. I felt bad because I kept him there longer than he probably needed to be, but after having our conversation, I thought, we need to have this same conversation or a similar conversation with others, because I just think it's so much needed in the church right now. I also wanted to say, and if Charles could maybe speak to this, I know that he also served as a reserve officer. I can't remember where. Can you note on that, Charles?
Absolutely. I served as a held a reserve police officer commission. Let me rephrase that. Had a police officers commission. I started as a reserve officer in the academy in Midland back in, I think, '91. And and they had a reserve academy. Finished it once I moved to Abilene and went through the West Central Texas Law Enforcement Academy there. Served as a instructor in the academy there for about 4 or 5 years. Finished my reserve training through West Central Texas Law Enforcement Academy, and ultimately took the exam and became a certified peace officer. And did 7 years on the force there in city of Merkel, which is just outside of Abilene, Texas, a suburb, I guess you could say, about 10, 15 miles outside of town. And when we moved, my real job, as my wife would call it, took me to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex as the assistant regional administrator for the Attorney General's office. I became a reserve officer with the city of Arlington. And so the Arlington Police Department had a reserve program. And so I served in that program there for about 2 years from 2000 through 2002, I believe, January, February 2002, until my kids got to a point where the weekends were no longer my own, and didn't want to be an absent dad. And so instead of going down and doing police stuff on Saturdays, and I spent time on the flag football fields and volleyball courts and those type of things with the kids. And so it was very worthwhile, but I left the law enforcement at that point. So.
Well, that actually brings up a really interesting point. And I think that maybe we have to start here. Unfortunately, we have to start with some of the, what I might call exaggerated claims. You know, I think that part of going back to what Jacob said earlier about talking past each other is that anytime somebody says there's a race problem in America, or there's racism in America, or there's, you know, our culture has these problems that are part of the situation, the context that we find ourselves in, anytime somebody brings that up, you know, there's this tendency to go to extremes. You know, there's this tendency to say, you know, maybe defensively to say, well, are you saying all white people are racist? Are you saying that all white people are bad? Or are you saying all police officers are bad and that the police department is, you know, corrupt or whatever? You know, are you saying everything is broken and wrong? And these sort of exaggerated claims that kind of get thrown out, and then those things become the only thing that we deal with and talk about, rather than saying, you know, no, we're talking about this right here. You know, we have these other things that are sort of peripheral that are out there. So maybe let's talk about that for just a second and sort of get that out of the way. Some of those claims, like, you know, all white people are bad, or all police officers are bad, or, you know, any talk about racism in America is really just liberal agenda or anything like that. So any of that, you know, strike a chord with you, Charles?
Well, you know, the thing about this, and I will say that I'm speaking, you know, from my own experiences and examples and things that have happened to me, family members and others. You know, you know, as a lot of people like to run out and say that they're, you know, speaking for the Black community or anything like this. You know, I speak for me and my experiences, right? And somebody else may have different experiences, and that's perfectly fine. That's what makes us unique, and that's what should make us as a country respect those differences and that being unique. So what I would say is that you know, extremism is bad, and it's used by anybody and everybody to try and you know, reshape the narrative. And so you have, you know, people in the Black community that will say that, you know, you never trust a single, you know, white person, and they're all white people are bad. And I don't agree with that. My wife is white, and I love her family and love lots of other you know, people and families. The congregations that I've attended, you know, over my years, the majority of them have been predominantly white, and most, I would say, overwhelmingly white. But at the same time, we go to Black congregations that are 100% Black, and we go to congregations when we travel that are a mix. And so I operate, I would say, in both worlds. But to get back to your question, is, there are people who will oftentimes do that because they want to try and shape the narrative. And anybody who says that all of anybody is one thing or the other is wrong. People who say that, all white people are racist, wrong. People who say that all black people steal and rape and rob and pillage, wrong. But what you will have oftentimes see people do is they will find and look for that one little thing that supports their position, and then they try and run it out as an aha moment. And we see so much of that. But absolutely not. I don't believe in extremes, and I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And so that's the way that I've lived my life. And so unless a person reacts or does something to me otherwise or different than that, there aren't any issues. And then what I try to do is, if somebody does say something or act racist in a way, because I've had that happen too, is, if I don't have to deal with them, I don't. I deal with and move on with somebody else, or I'll say, well, I get that you don't like me, but we have to work together on this project or this initiative. Let's do this because this will reflect poorly upon both of us. So let's get that done. And you know what? We don't have to go to breakfast. We don't have to go to lunch. We don't have to go to dinner. I don't have to come to your house. You don't have to come to my house. That's okay. Let's just get the work product done. And that oftentimes will turn somebody who may initially have had a preconceived idea into a friend later from that, and it fosters conversation.
Yeah, and can I comment on that, Wes?
Please do.
I think it's good. I appreciate everything that Charles has said, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with Charles, because I appreciate his wisdom, his clarity, and I'm coming from this from, of course, a different perspective and different background from Charles, because I feel like in a lot of ways I was in the past kind of addressing some of those extremes instead of engaging with the real issue, instead of sitting down and talking about, okay, what's some common ground here? What are some things that we can agree on? What are some things that we all agree on? And even in those areas where we might disagree, let's try and find why we're disagreeing with each other. Because I know that I agree with you on, 99% of things, and even friends and family members who I would engage with, where, and really, I guess what happened with me, and I don't know if this plays in a later part of the conversation, but, I had a moment where, some of my Black brothers in Christ who I respect and who I trust and who I love, they were saying some things, and that, hey, this is what I've endured. This is what I've gone through. And I felt that my responses were being pretty dismissive of their experiences and, or my non-response. And there was just kind of a moment where I thought, well, now wait a second, I listen and respect and love these guys on other areas. So I need to do the same here, instead of just responding to extreme situations. And I think that we're seeing a lot of that. And I think social media particularly fosters that type of mentality, where instead of being nuanced and articulate in how we engage with these things, we tend to just, as Charles said, overgeneralize, and which overgeneralizations are generally not true. As well as instances where you have to make an overgeneralization to say that. But I think there's a lot of truth in that. And if we can get away from, engaging in those extremes and come to the middle ground and have these discussions as brothers in Christ, and just have respect for each other and our own experiences and the background and the data and the truth. And I think a lot more can get done, and the church can take the forefront in that, of showing, hey, this is how you engage over sensitive issues. We talked about that this past Sunday here at Dripping Springs, and I hope the church can move forward as kind of being a light in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many things that we could, just be on that one subject right there about, giving people the benefit of the doubt, being gracious with each other when we talk. I think part of the reason these kind of conversations are challenging and difficult is sometimes we don't even know if we're using the right vocabulary. Do I say African American? Do I say Black? And I think that especially for, those that are trying to be sensitive, they're not even sure if, they're doing it, they're being as sensitive as they should be. And then it seems like other people are just tired of, trying to be PC, politically correct. And so they've just given up, and then they just say whatever's on their mind, and there's no sensitivity. And so I think that this type of an environment where you can talk to people one-on-one is the very best place to have these kind of conversations, is to just sit down with people and visit and be willing to be flexible with each other. And as you started your conversation, Jacob, to say, my perspective is different, my background is different, my experiences are different. So Charles, that's where I want to go next, is just to ask you, if you don't mind, to share some of your experiences with racism.
Well, Wes, just before I get there, just one thing that you mentioned that is just kind of resonated to me was, about people and, their concern about being politically correct, because that's, we've heard that, and that's turned into a buzz phrase, and, conservative circles, of which I have been in for 20 plus years, and still am, and so it's become a coined phrase that people like to use to say, well, it's about the liberal people. They want us to be politically correct. But even if you just think about that, is at what point have we gotten as a society to where we're okay with saying whatever comes out of our mouth, regardless of how it impacts the other person?
Yeah.
The same thing is, as a Christian, we're taught to be different than the world. We are taught to have, to bridle our tongue, to not say things that are going to be divisive or hurtful, or create or cause dissent. And so when we see us using those same things and taking that same stance, we have to realize, and Jake and I are talking about this, is that, there's the narrow road and the broad road. And, and we have to be careful that we haven't left the narrow, gotten on the broad, and are somehow thinking that we're on the narrowest of roads. And when we start adopting things that are part of the culture of our country, the larger culture of our country, and with that, I think our Christianity tells us to try and think about how things impact the other person that we're dealing with, the other groups that we're dealing with, that we're interacting with, and to also realize that we can all be in the same city, the same state and country, but there are nuances in the life experiences that people have. And so we can't just kind of homogenize that and say, oh no, this is a great country, everybody has an opportunity, and you have the poorest of people can grow up and become a NBA basketball player that makes $100 million a year. And you go back and say, well, how many people actually go that route and do that type of thing? And how many times there are people who have the skills, the physical skills, and God-given a talent, that never are able to do that because of something else that may have happened in their environment. So I just think that even those type of terms, we use them now. I've used them. I've heard other brothers, I've heard people who weren't Christians use them. And it's now seen as, I no longer have to be politically correct.
The Bible, which translates into, I think that's a great point, Charles, and I don't mean to hijack
Yeah.
what Wes was saying, but because I do want to transition into that next point. But I think that's a great point that, again, and Charles and I talked about this. He brought up a great point we were talking about the other day, the idea, and Charles, if you remember this, we talked about the idea and concept of trauma, and people operating from trauma, not only from their past, but from their history and their cultural context. And that might be the same case with phrases like that, where I think that there's a certain sense in which, okay, political correctness can be abused and used in a certain way. But the overreaction to that then becomes, like you said, I'm going to be as brash as I possibly can to show that I'm not politically correct, right? And that is, what about when Paul says, do all things that are honorable in the sight of all men, So that means that I have to consciously think about not only what I'm going to say, but how it's going to be perceived from other people, right? I mean, and that doesn't mean I can't speak truth, but that I need to be mindful of, okay, are they, if I say this in this way, are they going to hear it in the way that I want them to hear it?
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I could talk about that all day, but I thought that's a great point that he made.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that we tend to, and I think even the phrase politically correct, I think that it frames the entire conversation in terms of politics. And it's not about politics. It's about love for our neighbor. It's about love for our brother and sister. And I think that so often we don't know how to have these conversations because we only have them in the framework of political debate. And so even our language betrays the fact that we think of this as a political conversation, and it's not a political conversation. So the goal is not to be politically correct. It's to be loving. It's to be kind. It's to, consider others as more significant than ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a tremendous point. So yeah, back to you, Charles, on your perspective.
And so your question was its perspective on just general race, correct?
Yeah, and just some of your personal experiences, if you don't mind sharing.
Absolutely. And I'll try and be brief because I could go into detail. And so I would say that what I have seen and experienced has been largely outside of the work environment. And so you don't start out as a volunteer in an agency and rise to be the head of that agency without hard work, prayer, truly blessed. God blessed me along the way. It's with the abilities and reasoning and the work ethic, and I have instilled that in my kids is that if people will overlook a lot of things if they see that you can actually help them be successful. And so that's the way that my father taught me, and that's the way that I've tried to instill in my kids. But we, to say that I haven't had issues come up or there, and here's just some of them are frustrating and funny, and some were a little more serious. And one that I thought about here recently, and I was talking to my wife and daughter, was my son had made it to the Junior Olympics in Detroit, Michigan, I think back in 2002, I believe. And so they had him in Ann Arbor. They had the AAU Olympic Games there. And so I love football and college football and pro football. And so as we drove from Arlington, Texas, all the way up to Detroit and came back, we went on stadium tours. Yeah. And so we stopped in South Bend, Indiana, and went by, had to go by Notre Dame. And so we drove down to the stadium, and the gates were open. And so we parked the car and we walked through the gates and walked down the ramp, and you could see, and they've got the wooden benches, and there were people and groups of people, numbers of people all throughout. And so we walked up and we started walking around and, just really taking in the scenery. And it was amazing. And then there was a groundskeeper who was mowing the football field. And he looks up at us and he comes over, rides over there, and he says, "You can't be in here, get out of here." And I said, but the door was open, and he's like going, "You can't be in here." And so I'm looked, and there's at least 10 other groups of people, none of them black. And I said, "Well, these other people are in here." And he said, "I don't care. You can't be in here. Get out now." And so I just told the wife and kids, I said, let's go. And so we started walking back and back toward the tunnel, and we're headed up the tunnel to go back to the gate. And he rides past us on the lawnmower. And he goes to the gate, he closes the gate, and he locks it, padlocks it. And I look at him, and I was like going, "So how are we supposed to get out?" He said, "I don't know. Figure your way out." And he gets on his lawnmower, and he rides away. Now, all of these other people were in here, these other groups, no issue. I've myself been pulled over by a police officer, and with the family. It was about 10:30 at night. We had filled up at a gas station, and we're leaving to go and visit my mother. And I was a reserve officer teaching in the law enforcement academy there in Abilene. We were about 20 miles outside of town at Anson. And so he, lights and everything. And I had seen him there as I was filling up the car with gasoline, because I noticed it was odd because the light had turned green and he didn't leave. He stayed sitting there on the highway. And so once we got out and took off, we were about a block and a half down the road, and he turned his lights on. And so he came to the car, and his comments were, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "Well, officer, you mind telling me why you stopped me?" "Well, where are you going?" I said, "Well, do you want to tell me why you stopped me?" And so we kind of started this conversation, because I knew that he was going to stop me, right? And so we kind of went through this, and I stopped you because I saw you and I thought you were going to cross the line. I said, "So your job now is to stop me from committing a crime, a traffic crime, before I actually commit it." And so we kind of went through this thing, and ultimately I told him, I said, "I teach in the academy." And he said, "What?" And I told him, I said, "With Carolyn and Wes at West Central Texas Law Enforcement." I said, "Which you probably either come through there or will do." And I teach cultural diversity. And so he said, "You're a police officer?" And I showed him my badge, and he said, "Well, why didn't you tell me that up front?" I said, "Because that's not the point. That's not the point. If you didn't have a justified reason to stop me, you shouldn't have stopped me." But what he was planning to do was to go through and ask all these questions and to see what he could do, and probably, search my car or whatever it is. Because for him to actually say that I thought you were going to, cross the line. And so he's like, "Well, why were you weaving in the lane?" And I told him, I said, "I bought a bag of corn nuts and I was opening the corn nuts." I said, "But I made sure I didn't, cross any line." I said, "Because I knew you were behind me." And he said, "Well, but you were wobbling in the lane." I said, "No, you and I both know the traffic code does not say that that's a violation." So we moved through that, but I've had other circumstances. My son was when he was attending school in Lubbock, he got pulled over. He was in a car with two white females. He was in the back seat, and Lubbock PD pulled him over, got the young ladies out. They went back to the car, and they were there for a few minutes, and then they later came back, got in the car, and they drove away. And he's like, "Well, what was that about?" He said, "They were asking us if we were okay." And so they came to the car, got them out, and wanted to know if they were okay. And my daughter dealt with some things when we were here at Dripping Springs, where classmates and things of that nature. And so it is there. It's not pervasive, but there's an undercurrent. And that really is the thing that a lot of, I believe, from friends and family members that I've talked to, that they are addressing, and that they're at this point where it's kind of fed up, right? Is that you get stopped for something because the officer thinks that because you are black, I've gotten stopped because I have really nice cars. I've been blessed to have great jobs. And and you drive through a certain area, and you get pulled over for various reasons, and so you have to then go through that process. My brother-in-law, who's a coach at a university, has had that same experience, not when he's by himself, but when he has been with an African American coach that's with him in the car and been stopped on the interstate here in Texas. And so it's those type of things that I think a lot of people are reacting to, and you have people in a different group never experience that, or rarely experience that, and that is and so they don't see it, and it's not a lived experience for them.
Yeah,
I like how you describe that, Charles. An undercurrent, which if something's an undercurrent, it has a tendency to be overlooked, right? Or it has a tendency to not, like you said, be shared or experienced by maybe not everyone, but enough. And I do want to attest to the fact that Charles does have nice cars. But I think that, again, listening to those experiences, the experiences of my brother-in-law who's black, some things that even they have questioned me about, that kind of help me to see certain things, where they're like, well, let me ask you this, have you ever had to get out of your car and have your car searched simply because you were going over a couple of miles over the speed limit? Now, I've been stopped for speeding before, but I've never had to do that. There was no reason, for it from their perspective, So I think being able to listen and we might come back to this a little bit later, to empathize with that instead of dismiss it, to find ways to say, I don't think I can fully understand that experience because of who I am, but I want to find ways to empathize, and I think of when Paul talks about within the church, especially, if one member of the body suffers, then the whole body suffers with it, and that means that member is suffering in a way that you actually aren't suffering, right? I mean, you're not actually physically or emotionally suffering the way that they are, but as being a part of the body, because you are so intimately connected within Christ, you do, and you should try to find ways to commune in that suffering with each other. Does that make any sense?
Well, and I think what I get from that, and I agree with, is that I may not have had the same circumstance happen to me, but in understanding from your perspective that this is what's happening,
Right.
is that I then say, that's not right. So let's work together to begin to change this experience so that you don't have to experience that either.
Right.
And I think that's where we oftentimes fall short. It's out of sight, out of mind, or it's not my problem, it's your problem. So you go ahead and fix it. And then when people do try to fix it, we allow people to put a spin or a narrative on it that then doesn't get the support of those people who would naturally come to the defense of that and say that is an injustice. And I think that's what we see in our country and across society, and that's what we've had all along. And so I like Wes, when he's laying this out about what I would say the extremes. And my opinion is that the overwhelming majority of white people in this country aren't racist. to the point where I will now do something to actively do something to act upon a prejudice and those type of things. What I say is that, and there are people that they go, I'm not racist, and I believe them 100%. But what happens is that by not trying to understand where the other person or the other group is coming from, they allow a system that may be operating a certain way to continue to operate. Because if the masses begin to adjust it, it won't. And if you just look back in our brief history 50, 60 years ago during the civil rights struggle, that was one of the key aspects from Martin Luther King Jr. was we have to get people to put this on television. We have TV now, live TV, video. And because those laws and the standards and the separate but equal and the all of those things, and drinking fountains and everything else, there were people who were willing to say, well, yeah, that's old. We shouldn't be doing that before. They shouldn't have done it 70 years ago, 100 years. But until it's brought to the forefront, and until people saw that people were having dogs and fire hoses and getting beaten, and seeing what was occurring, for people who just wanted to ride at the front of the bus, sit wherever you want on the bus, take a drink out of a fountain that is there and is a nice fountain and not the corroded one that's down the hall and in the back, to sit at a diner at a table and eat food. And when people start saying, well, if that's the issue and this is what they're wanting, then why can't I support that? And that's where you had all of the people in the country who were not racist, but had not dealt with the structure of inequity that was in the system, begin to say, this isn't right, and you had change. And so it's just that it's that way, and it's going to have to be constant. And for people to say that everybody, racist and it's just like you have people, some who say, well, the blacks commit 85% of the crime in the country. And you say, well, no, not actually. But then you go back and you start looking at, if you're patrolling certain neighborhoods and writing everybody up for every little thing and they're getting arrested and you're constantly searching them and you're not doing others, then the numbers can become what you want the numbers to become. And again, that doesn't mean that every police officer is racist. But what it does say is that there is peer pressure. You and I all know about peer pressure. We teach our kids about it. We talk about it in churches and with friends. And you have good people who are in circumstances and see certain things, and they may not speak up because of the pressure or what may happen to them or how they are perceived. And so they go along with it. And that can be across the racial spectrum. You can have black police officers that are just as oppressive as the most oppressive white person on the police department, because they're wanting to gain acceptance, and it's the pressure. And so that's where you start looking at things that are more systemic and situational, because if my life is in my hands and I'm as an officer and I'm wrestling with somebody on the street and I hit my emergency button or I call out emergency, 1033 or whatever, I want other officers to be able to get in their cars and race to me because my life may be in jeopardy and likely is in jeopardy. But if I am seen a certain way, people naturally think they may not get there quite as fast. And it could be a life or death situation for me or someone else. And so once you're in the club, you remain in the club. And it's that way across our life. We're tribal. We not only along racial lines, but we're tribal along socioeconomic lines. We're tribal along religious lines. I can't tell you the number of times that I've talked to somebody in a meeting or after a meeting, and so they're like going, and you find out it's like, oh, you remember the church? Oh, I remember the church. And then all of a sudden you have a little. It's the way we are, and that's okay. But we just have to be constantly reminding of ourselves that we are that way. and not to act out on things that are more easy for us because of perceived differences or similarities.
Well, and maybe that. Sorry, Wes. Did you
No,
have a
you're good.
comment?
You're good. Go
Well,
ahead.
maybe that helps us to transition. If I'm not steering this in a conversation, because I don't want us to go so long that people don't listen to the entire conversation. But I think Charles did a natural transition into the discussion of systemic racism, what is meant by that. And I think I was thinking about this. And going back to what Charles and I previously talked about the idea of trauma, and how generations can deal with maybe the effects of trauma. Charles, I was going to get your thoughts on this. Maybe another way to describe this is there are some residual effects of past generations, residual racism, things that haven't quite met up to the expectations and the promises of the civil rights movement and past successes that we have had, to where we can say, okay, technically, this is how it should be, but because of people, because of perceptions, it hasn't been implemented up to the promises and the hopes of these things. Would you say that would be an accurate assessment of it?
I would, and then for any system like that to be there in today's environment is it can't be probably nearly as overt as it used to be, and which would, I think, repulse the greater number of people in our society. And so things begin to happen, and they are supported in a certain way by making sure that the masses of well-intended good people, whether they're faith Christians or not, don't see it and don't become engaged in change. And so I do believe that there's structure that helps to create the divides, and it preys upon the divides that are there. And I think it's done more for political gain, which also turns, political gain is a offshoot of economic and financial gain. And so there's so many connections that that happen, and how this is woven through the fabric of our society is everybody, regardless of their race or ethnicity, wants to do well, and they want the best for their families. I don't know of anyone, and haven't known anybody, and I've known people who were extremely poor and people who are extremely wealthy, and they've all wanted the best for their kids. And but there are certain people who think that people don't care about their kids, and poor people, and they think that and they will think to a certain level, poor, whether that's black, white, Hispanic, don't care about their kids. And then even below that, they'll think, well, and then the brown people really don't care about their kids. And so it's that type of thing that is there. And I do believe that the system is, there is a system, and I believe it's supported because the good people who would stand up and change the system don't see it, because they don't encounter that system, and they don't interact with other people who may be living a different experience. And
and can you real quickly, Charles, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you real quickly just, I think a good example of that to kind of help people to see some of that is that experience that you told me about with that deputy that you backed up that one time?
Right, yes. And so had a Taylor County Sheriff's deputy, and I was doing police work in Merkel, and so and we had some kids that were up at a parking lot, and they had the trucks and cars backed in together, and they were drinking alcohol, underage drinking. And so I went over because I was on patrol for the city, and so he and wrote minor in possession, Class B misdemeanor tickets, citations to the kids. Yeah, I didn't have a problem. That's, the law is Class B. He could have arrested him for it, and yeah, no issue at all. And so then a couple of weeks later, he's back, and we are there, and so oh, and by the way, he confiscated the beer and all that stuff. And so then a couple of weeks later, he's back after another home football game, and so he's going through, and so there's another group of kids, and so he takes the beer and he makes them pour out the beer that they had that was open, and he said, all right, now get out of here. And so I kind of went, okay, that's not what we did 2 weeks ago. So I kind of asked him if I could talk to him. So we kind of stepped over to the side. And so he said, well, I'm not going to ruin these kids' lives, with this, with these tickets. And I said, well, 2 weeks ago, you wrote everybody MIPs. The kids before 2 weeks ago were Black and Hispanic. The kids in this group were all white. And so in his own mind, and he would probably tell you, I'm not racist. And he, but what he was doing is he had undervalued the life and trajectory for these kids that were brown. And it was, they're not going to do anything with their lives. And so me writing them tickets, it's fine. And both aspects were within his right as the officer first officer on the scene. He didn't have to write tickets, but his reasoning for not doing it to the group of white kids was, I'm not going to ruin their lives with this, because he knew that if he writes minor in possessions for these kids, is that they're gonna have a conviction. Their parents are gonna have to pay something. It may influence them if they try to go to the military and all of these other things. But he was willing to do it for one and not the other. And that's how, and this was 95, 96, 97-ish in that area. And so, but that's the way that you see this kind of happening. And he would probably say, I'm not racist. Well, he wasn't rude and belligerent. He didn't, throw the kids into the cars. He didn't, do any of those type of things. He didn't use any racist language. But the way that he interacted, because what he assumed their lives would ultimately be, is problematic. And that's where you start seeing some of these societal things and these and how it begins to be set up to where you stop somebody and they're arrested for jaywalking as opposed to somebody else, and you just let them cross the street.
Well, and I think, I feel like I'm excluding Wes right here because he hadn't had a chance to comment in a while. Wes, are you still there? So.
Yeah, I'm still here.
I think, it's something that Charles, you had said to me, which kind of helped to open my eyes, was how many times had something like that been perpetuated by just that particular officer? And so, how many groups had he come into contact with where that had a rippling effect, just from that one particular officer. And of course, I'm sure that there were others who acted in a similar way. And I want to go on record, because I didn't get to say earlier, I love our law enforcement officers, and some of my best friends are law enforcement officers. We have a banquet here to support and to encourage them every year that Charles is a part of at our church. And we're going to continue to have that. But at the same time, I think having instances like that, we say, okay, now I'm beginning to see what you're talking about. And it helps my, sorry, my video went out there. It helps me to see that, and maybe we can, Wes, I don't know if you had any comments or thoughts on that, or.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Charles is really getting to the heart of it here. And I think that sometimes we ignore the fact that Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, were not that long ago. And we act like this was ancient history. And even if it was ancient history still plays a part in present day circumstances. All history plays a part in circumstances. Our cultural context has evolved from something. And sometimes we, are so far removed from history, we don't know how it has impacted and affected and shaped our current situation. But when we talk about the systemic problems that exist now and how those evolved from things of the past, almost every Christian I know can look back and say, yeah, the laws that existed in the 50s and 60s were wrong, but we've come so far since then. And sure, I mean, there's been a lot of progress that's been made, and I'm so incredibly thankful for the progress that's been made. But if we can't see that these cycles that started all the way back at slavery and white supremacy that existed back then, it evolved into what we have today. And yes, it has evolved to something better than it has been, but these problems still exist. And I think you pointed that out really well, Charles, with just that those assumptions that are below the surface and that come out whether we realize it or not, when we say, well, I wouldn't want to write these particular kids a ticket because they have a future and they're going to go on to do something, and I don't want to mess up their future. What we are implicitly saying about the other group of kids. And I hear those kind of things from people all of the time, that we don't realize sometimes how our language betrays the problems that exist in our heart, the assumptions that we're making about whole groups of people. And I think that when events like George Floyd, when someone like George Floyd is killed, and then everything that happens in response to that, there is this knee-jerk reaction from people to say, well, this police brutality or systemic racism, it's not really a problem. You're blowing things out of proportion. And people will quote statistics about how many white people were shot by police officers versus how many Black people were shot by police officers. And I want to stop and say, time out. That's not the whole picture here. Some of the time, it's situations like you described that's never going to make a statistic anywhere. But I shouldn't say every, but nearly every African-American brother in Christ that I've sat down and have these conversations with, they have experiences similar to yours. This is a common experience in the African-American community. And we're not just talking about in the inner city, we're talking about every law-abiding, every Christian law-abiding Black man in America, for the most part, has experienced this at one time or another. And the conversations and experiences that one family has versus another family are just totally different. My father never had to give me instructions about how to stay alive in a traffic stop. I never had to be given those kind of instructions, and our experiences are so different. And it doesn't mean that white cops are going around shooting everybody. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that there are cycles that were put in place a very long time ago, and that we continue to see played out, sometimes in very subtle ways, but life-altering ways. That officer didn't want to affect the life of those white students, but he perpetuated a cycle that's been going on in the life of those other students for a very long time, and it continues to perpetuate that cycle.
Well, and real quickly, and I apologize for this, but I might actually have to go in a little bit and allow y'all to continue the conversation. I forgot that I've got to pick up my kids from a day camp. That's why that my wife's not able to pick them up because she's nannying another child. But I shared an article with Charles about this, and we discussed it, written by David French. And one of the things he mentioned there, which I thought was a good thought, was, with 356 or so years of institutionalized racism within our country, it's somewhat naive to think that everything is going to be fixed in 56 years, since the civil rights movement. Now, we've made, I think we all agree, as you've mentioned, made leaps and bounds. And we're doing our best to avoid those extremes. But two things can be true at once. We can have made progress and appreciate our country and love the blessings that we have here. and at the same time say, here's some things that we need to work on. I think of it like a marriage, a marriage that maybe was in crisis 10 years ago, and they have done a lot to work on that marriage over the past 10 years. But I don't know anybody that would say, okay, we're good now. We don't have anything that we don't need to work on. There's some areas that we could use some work, and I think that maybe some of those discussions are, and Charles could maybe comment on this, is there's the maybe practical measures within the kingdoms of the world, and then also what's expected of us within the church. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Charles. And
well, I think from the world perspective is, we have to be willing to seek first to understand, right? And that's kind of a universal American ism, I guess you could say. It's not utilized very much in today's society, but it means that and for me to first seek to understand, the first thing I have to do is to understand that you as a person is someone that I should invest my time and effort and energy in, and is worthy of actually me doing that to try and understand. And it doesn't mean that, and I think people move at such a light speed today that it makes it easier. And it's not that the person says, well, I don't really care about, this color person or that color person. That's not in their mindset. It's, why do I want to stop and give this person the time for me to really try and understand their issues, when it's so much easier for me to do the drive-by. And so I think that really is what we have to do and it comes from us calling ourselves a Christian nation. And we are a country that was founded on Christian ideals and principles. And I believe that we are. But just like any other society, I believe that we have continued to drift further and further away. And that doesn't mean that the founding fathers who founded the country on those principles had all the answers, because we know that how they felt. There was a disagreement about whether or not the country from the very beginning, was it going to be slave owning or not? And there were people that said, absolutely, it's wrong, it's abhorrent, we shouldn't do it. And there were people that were saying, absolutely, we have to have it. If not, we can't do this. And so they created compromises. And so we're kind of living through all of that, as you were talking about, from a historical perspective. And no one would have somebody who had been, if you had a woman who had been abused for years and years and years in a relationship, or sex trafficked, to then say, okay, we arrested the guy, put him in jail, you're free, your shackles are off, be well, go and pursue the American dream. And to see that person struggle with what they had dealt with for years and years and years. No, what we do now, and this gets back to that trauma-informed care, what we do now is we help these individuals, whether it's with school or with work or job, it's counseling, all of these things to try and take them to a place to where they can be as whole as possible. And we all know that these cycles of violence and cycles of addiction, they go from generation to generation to generation when they aren't properly addressed. But for some reason, as much as we begin to see and understand and we set courses for that, we don't see it in any other communities. And you look at the opioid epidemic, and with and heroin and those type of things, when that was running through and ravaging the African American community, the response to that from our country largely was It's a crime, and you take them, you lock them up, mandatory sentences and everything else. And then once it begins to impact the heartland, 20 years later, the response is billions and billions of dollars into addiction and treatment. And these people shouldn't be locked up. They just need help and treatment. And the community, the African American community, sees that and says, we were screaming and asking for help. And the response to that was incarceration, bigger prisons, more prisons. And so those are the type of things that we have to begin to understand and see, because a lot of what happens in our country starts in the lower socioeconomic classes and moves its way through. And we can't just deal with it once it hits the big spot. We have to be able to jump in and deal with these earlier on. And I think that will help repair a lot of the issues, the racial issues and concerns in our country. And as a country, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Everybody talks about cost avoidance. Well, let's start here when it's in these smaller communities and address it where it doesn't blow up and we have to spend billions and billions of dollars on it later.
Yeah, and and you may be getting to this next, Charles, but I keep thinking about the church, and from our perspective, it breaks my heart that we allowed in this country something that Paul fought so hard against. And Paul fought throughout his entire ministry. He fought against a segregated church. He fought against a Jew church and a Gentile church. He fought against that, and he said, if we're going to live out the gospel, then every church has to be male and female. It has to be Jew and Gentile. It has to be slave and free. We're all one family. We drink from the same spirit. We're part of one family. And he would not allow the church to be segregated and for different groups to say, I'm not going to associate with you. He called that walking out of step with the gospel. But in America, we allowed that to happen. We allowed and often participated in the segregating of ourselves. And so what breaks my heart is that that's still the case, that we still not only are segregated in where we worship, but we're very much segregated in not being able to have these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. So Charles, from your perspective, what do you think the church can do? What could be next steps for the church? Again, this is generally speaking and broad, but what can we do to help to heal? I love the fact that you're talking about this in terms of trauma, because I think that's exactly right. This is generational trauma. What can we do to help to heal the wounds that have been caused by so much pain? What can we do to move forward with healing and unity?
I would say that, to me, the first step is understanding our humanness. And Jacob had a great lesson on Sunday, where he's talking about, we're all born and created in the image of God. And we have to first go back to biblical principles. And particularly within, the Church of Christ, where we say that we want to be the church that you read in the New Testament, and that's who we profess to be. We let the Bible speak where the Bible speaks, and we don't speak where it doesn't speak. And so if we truly want to begin to live that out, we have to understand that part of that is moving outside of our comfort zones of familiarity. Whether it's racial or it's socioeconomic, and those type of things. And to see value in everybody and to say, what, I don't think where we are is the right place. And let me take the first step. Maybe it's a minister talking to the eldership, or the eldership talking to the members, and as a congregation, let's have times where we go and sit down with other leaders of other organizations and churches, and begin to understand and see people and to have a dialogue. When we let people know about gospel meetings, we generally send them within those groups. There's not any cross-pollination. So something as simple as that, of what that does is that symbolizes and it signals to the African American congregations that may be in church, is that we want you to come and visit with us. And then when some of those members come, have a conversation, have them over for lunch. And then maybe when they have a gospel meeting, they send notification to you and you're able to go. And that's where we begin to do this. It isn't about, oh, we're going to take all of our congregation, we're going to force you guys to go to this place or that place. But you begin to understand that people have their differences, but people at their core, we really can be united with. Everybody wants to be able to pay their bills. Everybody wants a nice home. They want, good cars. They want a good educational system, and so if we can begin there and see and understand that, then it's about, well, how can I help you attain some of your dreams without me becoming upset that, or fearful that if I help you attain your dreams, somehow you're going to surpass me and it's going to change what my dreams are. And, because I used to have a lot of conversations with people, a few years ago, when it was, the conversation was, we need to take our country back. That was the political mantra. And I'd say, well, where did our country go? That the White House is still there, Congress is still there, we're still electing people. And so it beyond who was, in the seat of president, and I didn't vote for him because I didn't like his policies. I did have a sense of pride as, hey, this is the first African American president. This is another opportunity. But then when you start seeing what starts happening soon after that, you kind of go, yeah, well, so maybe we hadn't moved as far down the road as we thought we had, right? Yeah. But a lot of people will see that and go, ooh, I would never do that. I would never say that. I would never act that way. But then they don't ever take the next step to say, well, maybe I should speak up and try and address that and stop it. And so.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, brother. And I think that so much of what you've said, it will be eye-opening. I know it is for me, and I'm sure it will be for so many others. And, and I keep thinking about a word that you used earlier and that I keep hearing in all of these conversations is understanding, and how important that trying to understand each other really is. And I heard a conversation that John Mark Hicks had with someone this last week, African American brother in Christ, and this brother said that I don't think you hate me, but I also don't think you understand me. And I think that was a really helpful way to say that nobody is saying that, hey, all you white Christians, we think that you're all hateful and racist. And that's not what the majority of us are saying when we have this conversation. Just admitting that there's a problem in our culture isn't saying that everything is broken or everybody is bad and racist. But it does say that there needs to be some conversations. There needs to be conversations individually, and there needs to be conversations collectively as congregations and churches. And we've got to embrace each other as family and treat each other as family. And I love what you've said a couple of times about giving people, or understanding that everybody wants the same things. Everybody loves their kids. Everybody wants the best for their kids. Everybody wants the best for the next generation. And it hurts me so many times when I see people say things about the African American community. Well, they don't care about fill in the blank. Right. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. All you have to do is sit down and have a conversation to know they do care. It's like saying, well, they don't care about abortion, so I'm not going to care about this. Or they don't care about black on black crime, so I'm not going to care about this. Of course, of course, everyone cares about all of those things. And Jacob said a minute ago that two things can be true at the same time. And we've got to understand that everybody wants what's best for their family. Everybody wants what's best for the next generation. And living out the gospel is saying, I want to know you, and I want to help you, and I want you to be able to achieve your dreams at the same time that I'm helping my children achieve their dreams.
Right. Absolutely. And it just comes down to humanness, and and we have to be careful of these our speech and the absolutisms that where we overgeneralize or place stereotypical connotations on different things about groups and people. And because I've had friends that say, well, if they blacks cared about black on black crime, then you've got look at Chicago. And I'd say, well, that there are probably 100 groups in Chicago that are trying to eliminate black on black crime, right?
Yeah.
So what are you doing to maybe help them, or how can we help them? And so there are a lot of things that people just don't see, and they parrot things because it's easy. And we all do things out of comfort. I mean, how many of us got in a car and drove to work, and once you got there, you pulled in your parking spot and you kind of went, wow, I didn't remember turning on that street or going down that, going through this light or whatever it may be. And because we do things on autopilot, and our body is extremely adaptable. Our mind is an amazing creation that God has given us. And things have to jolt us for us to pay attention to them. And so that's really what I really try to get at, is that if people are self-aware and can say that, maybe this that's going on right now is the jolt, but don't recoil because somebody says something and they may missay it, or maybe they said it the way they intended, but it shouldn't have been said that way, and you just totally write off everything that's going on there. When the Black Lives Matter thing came out and started, it was amazing. I figured it was going to happen. How quickly, no, it's all lives matter and blue lives matter, and it was, well, of course, all lives matter, right. But the life experiences that people were dealing with, and some people were dealing with, is that theirs didn't seem to matter at the same level. And so that was the reason for making that moniker, and so, but you get the mission, it gets kind of taken, and it gets a different connotation and a spin on it, and then you have, again, good people won't support it because of the misinformation that they begin to see and hear as a result of it. And we just have to realize that's the way the world is. And hopefully, the work that you're doing, Wes, today, and that this will get people to at least be willing to say, it's possible that somebody else in my same city has a different life experience of living in this city than I do. And that's okay. And if there is something that I can do about improving their life experience, then as a Christian, why wouldn't I want to help that? And it all starts by realizing that when we all get to heaven, I sure hope that people don't think that we're going to be segregated, because I don't believe that under any stretch of the imagination. Because as you pointed out, everything that Paul was taught and what we read in the Bible, those barriers are artificial construct of people. And God doesn't operate that way, and we're all going to be up there together, and so that's the important thing for us to understand, that if we can do it there, we have to try and make it work here.
Yeah. Oh, that's so well said, brother. I don't want to take anything away from that or add to it, because that was just perfect. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your perspective with us, and I appreciate you so very much. And I'm glad Jacob put us together. And I'm sorry he had to jump off the call, but I really appreciate you taking the time to share your heart with us, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you for the opportunity.